So we're very lucky and so pleased to have Dr. Gabor Maté join us today. Gabor is a best-selling author, a renowned speaker, a physician with over 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience. He's worked for over a decade in the Vancouver's downtown east side, and his expertise is specifically in addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. So you all understand why we've invited Gabor to come and share some reflections today. A warm welcome to Gabor, and when he starts speaking, his screen will come on your interview.
Well, thank you for inviting me, for joining here. I don't really have a whole lot to say. I thought we'd have a conversation rather than a didactic teaching, but just some thoughts at the top of my head. When you look at the research on what stress is, the biggest triggers for stress are uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control, and conflict. So I think under the present situation, the first three are checked off right away. Uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control. And when I say that these are the triggers for stress, I mean that these are the stimuli that set off the body's stress response mechanisms, which means the flight or fight mechanism.
Hey.
Does the dog want to say something?
I'm sure Loretta, we're trying to mute that dog.
Okay, great. So no, maybe the dog might have something good to say for all we know. Maybe they're plugged into something that we're not. So these are the triggers that set off the body's stress response mechanism, which means the changes in the nervous system, in the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the hormone levels, particularly the hormones of stress, cortisol, and adrenaline, which in the long term are helpful to escape or to alter a dangerous situation. But in the long term, those same stress hormones undermine our health. So you can see how this situation going on for a long time, depending on how we respond to it, can be stressful and possibly physiologically harmful. That's not a given. It depends on how we respond to it. So because here's another thing about stress, that there's three components to the stress reaction. There's the external event that happens. That's called the stressor. Then there is the physiological stress reaction that I've outlined in terms of the heart rate and the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, the immune system, the hormonal apparatus, the gut, and so on. That's the physiological response. But in between the external event and the physiological stress response, that is what is called the processing apparatus. And guess what? The processing apparatus is you and I. And that means how we interpret the event, how it makes us feel about ourselves and the world, what perceptions we have about it. So that means that there's no such thing as a universal stressor. There's no such thing as an event that affects everybody the same way. We're going to be affected by this event according to a number of factors in our personal histories. Now, one thing that's obvious on a strict physiological level, if you look at it in the United States, and the same concerns are being raised in Canada, the virus is not hitting everybody equally. In other words, the death rate, for example, in the African American community is higher than in the Caucasian community. Well, why is that? That's because African Americans and other racial minorities, including our First Nations community in Canada, are under higher stress most of the time, which means that the same virus is hitting a body that's already under stress. And that already means that the immunity of that particular system is impaired compared to somebody who's not under stress. So just on a straight level, who the virus hits, no, of course it can take anybody at any level of society, at any level of economic status. That's true. But disproportionately, it's going to hit people who are more stressed, and who's more stressed and who's not is not just an individual question. It's also a socioeconomic and cultural and political question.
Right, right. So,
That,
so Gabor, I wanted to ask. It's Karen. Thank you for that. Especially the piece around stress and the indicators of stress. It makes sense. In my household, I know we've all been saying to each other, "Oh, look how we are short with each other," and we're just in the immediate sense seeing some stress. I wanted to ask about sort of the larger field. But would you say that we are experiencing some form of collective trauma right now? And if so, are there having that awareness? Can we be doing things to mitigate it?
sure, so I'll answer that, but I just want to complete what I was saying about the stress, which is that
Okay.
how we perceive something has a lot to do with how we experience that. So if you're somebody who has to be in control all the time, because otherwise you're anxious, that's just how you grew up. That's how you were programmed. Then the present situation may be a lot more stressful for you than somebody who says, well, life is uncertain, like the Buddhists say, relax, everything's out of control. And if you take it that way, you'll be far less stressed. So what I'm saying is, so in relationship to your question about trauma, Karen, how traumatized we are does depend very much on how we approach this and what our predispositions are. Now, in terms of collective trauma, we're already seeing certain manifestations. Reports are that domestic violence has gone up. You talk about being shorter, less patient with your household members. There's been a spike in overdoses. So lots of calls to mental health facilities and helplines in the last few weeks, they're going up, which means that a lot of people are experiencing this as highly, highly stressful. Whether we're traumatized or not depends on how we handle it. Trauma is not just uncertainty or pain or disappointment or frustration or anxiety. Trauma is the imprint that's left in our bodies and our souls by whatever happens to us. And that has to do with how we manage to process or not process what's going on. So whether or not there's a collective trauma, we'll have to look back and see. The chances are pretty high that this will have been traumatic for a lot of people in a collective sense. But I think that's the question that we'll be able to answer in retrospect. And meanwhile, the real question for us is how to prevent this difficult event from becoming traumatic. In other words, how do we process it? How do we deal with it collectively and as households and as individuals so that it doesn't leave a wound? That's what trauma means. Trauma is a wound that hasn't healed. So can we go through this in a way that will not be left with a wound that isn't healed? Well, time will tell, but surely this conversation is an aspect of the effort to avoid this becoming traumatic for us.
Sure, that makes lots of sense. Gabor, I'm getting some feedback in the chat. People are having a little trouble hearing you. If you maybe could speak slightly closer to the mic.
Well, maybe, would this help if I put this on?
Let's try it. Sing us a little song. We'll see how you sound.
Okay.
Oh, much better. Thank you.
Is that better? Okay, great. I'll just write this down.
Yeah, no, that's much better. A lot of people are talking about what this means for children and young people at this time and looking for tools or advice on how to minimize the stress on young folks at this time. What would you say about that?
Well, the experience of London under the Nazi, under the Blitz, under the Nazi bombing blitz during the Second World War is instructive that way. So some children were evacuated from London to avoid the bombing. So they stayed with strangers, sometimes relatives, in the countryside for some months. Other children stayed in London throughout the bombing, and they heard the crashing and the sirens and the lockdowns and experienced what their parents went through. But guess which group was more traumatized at the end on looking back?
Well,
Make
now
it get.
Rick,
Make
now
it get.
question.
Make
I would have got my child out. So I would say the children that stayed would be more traumatized, would be my guess.
No, it was the children that were separated from their parents.
Attachment.
Yeah, attachment. So the real issue here is how we this is going to affect kids according to how we as parents handle it. So if those parents in London, I'm sure they went through the whole gamut of emotions, from fear to rage to anxiety and everything else. Nevertheless, they dealt with it. And as far as we can tell, they dealt with it with a lot of courage and fortitude. And that's what the kids need to see. So it's not the thing out there that's going to affect the kids. It's how the parents are with them that's going to affect the kids.
So hold them close, in other words.
You hold them close, and you also deal with yourself, so that you process your emotions. You hang out with your own feelings. You don't try and project them into some feverish activity, and you don't project them onto the kids by getting angry with them because they're getting a bit cabin feverish on you.
I had one more question, and then we wanted to open it up to people on the call. If you have questions, you could type them into the chat box, and we'll do our best to scan them and try and articulate them to Gabor. My last question before we open it up to other questions is around, this is a time, the rather larger social dynamics at play. I mean, this is a time of dissolution, of chaos. And, I know from the work that I've been doing around how people respond to climate change and that the hope and despair, that if we can open to the possibility for transformation in these moments, things really can shift. And, the world is going to be remade by this crisis in all kinds of ways. And what would you say, what are anything that you could say that we could be doing now to ensure that the world that we reconstruct after this is one that's based as much as we can and from a place of compassion and connection rather than separation?
Well, so let's look at what this crisis is revealing about the world. So you mentioned climate change. If I asked you, to ask any rational person, which is the bigger threat to humanity, COVID or climate, what would you say?
I think the average person might say COVID right now, but I would say climate.
No, in the long term.
Oh, in the long term, climate.
Yeah. Well, where has been the response to the climate change that's anyway proportionate to a response to the COVID crisis?
Yeah, completely no resonance. Yeah.
Nowhere, right?
Yeah.
In other words, this thing is revealing stuff about society. One of them is that we can actually come together and governments can actually get on board and do things very quickly and very radically. There's no money for social programs. All of a sudden, there's $2 trillion available. So the question is not just can we reshape society, but who's doing the reshaping?
Mm-hmm.
Now that has to do with political and economic situations and who's in control. So there was an economic crisis in 2008 and the world was reshaped, but who did the reshaping? The same people who caused the crisis in the first place. So they reshaped it to their benefit. And I can see now, so in this present situation, there's all kinds of possibilities. But when we say we have to be realistic about it. Will the capitalist system use this crisis as a way of getting rid of a whole lot of small businesses who all of a sudden lost their ground, and more of a takeover by big corporations? That's a possibility. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just, I'm going historically. That's, Naomi Klein writes about disaster capitalism, how they use the disasters to gain more control, more power, and more profit generating capacity. So when we talk about reshaping, it's a political question as well, of who does the reshaping, and or do people go back to their lives hoping just to survive, hoping just to create something for themselves and their families, and ignore and leave the larger questions to the so-called leaders? Because surely that's what led us into the current climate crisis, is that the system is able to essentially disenfranchise or silence or alienate large numbers of people that they're no longer involved in making these decisions. And they don't even think they have any capacity to be involved. So how we come out of this and how we reshape it has to do with, does this awaken some consciousness in a lot of people? I mean, what lesson have we learned here? We've learned, guess what, everybody? Hold on to your seats. We're all connected. I mean, Buddhists and Hindus and other spiritual leaders have only been saying that for 3,000 years. And all of a sudden we realize it. Well, are we going to remember that? Are we going to remember that when this is over? Or is that only a temporary flash of insight? Well, I don't, I have my own predictions as to how the system's going to go, but I do see all kinds of possibilities.
Right. So how can, and the other thing we've learned, of course, is that we're all connected and that we all are part of nature. There is no separation between human and nature.
Yeah. Guess what, people? We're all part of nature.
Yeah.
Who knew? Who knew?
Yeah. The humans versus nature. Something's missing from that paradigm. Questions in the chat. Sorry, I got an echo there. There's a number of questions about how we might process this. You talked about how we process this stress will determine whether or not it really becomes a trauma or not. So there's quite a few questions about practices for processing the stress in the moment, and particularly given that we're in the social distancing time, so we don't necessarily have the physical presence of the people that we love, or the some of the soothing that comes from human contact. So some advice on key practices for processing the stress?
Well, here's what I can only repeat what I understand of the Buddhist teachings, which is you have to be with whatever there's there. So if your child comes to you with anger or fear or terror, you wouldn't try and distract them by turning on a TV set. Not if you're a conscious parent. You wouldn't tell them not to feel that way because, don't worry about it, it'll pass. You would really hold that child with that feeling and just let them go through it. And what traumatizes is not that bad things happen, but that bad things happen and we're not unable to move through our natural reaction to them. So that's what actually creates the trauma. So this is a longer, deeper conversation, and what I'm able to say may be shocking for people, but it's not an episode of sexual abuse per se, for example, that's traumatic. It's how that's responded to by the environment. So if something terrible happens to a person, but they can go to somebody who is compassionate and has strength and they can tell their story and listen to their sobs and hold them as they move through the emotions that that terrible event evoked in them, that person will not be traumatized. The trauma is when there's nowhere to share it, no one to hear it, nowhere to validate it, no one to help you move through it. So this is where we come back to the Buddhist teachings, which is that when you have these, as I understand them, and I'm no example of a Buddhist practitioner or teacher, but I'm giving you my understanding. When you have feelings, whatever they are, can you be that compassionate person to yourself who can allow those feelings, permit them to move through you, uh, perhaps find somebody to talk to about it, online or in person, and in any case, neither to distract yourself from it, nor to make yourself wrong for having those feelings, but just simply allow yourself to experience them, and with the compassionate witnessing of your own presence. That's my best understanding.
No small task, but the life work of all of us, right? To be our most, to hold ourselves with compassion as best we can, and those around us, definitely. There's a number of questions, Gabor, in the chat about vulnerable communities and people that have friends in communities that are more vulnerable, like the Downtown East Side, or different communities of color. There's people are asking advice about how we can be supportive to people who are in more vulnerable communities, or are more vulnerable themselves.
Yeah. So when you think of the downtown east side of Vancouver, with people living in single room occupancy facilities with no cooking capacity and so on, and furthermore, if they're dependent on drugs that are illegal under the utterly barbaric laws that we have right now in this country, how exactly are you going to practice social distancing? You have to go out there and get your cocaine or your heroin, otherwise you go through withdrawal. So how are you going to practice social distancing? How are you going to practice social distancing when you have no meal preparation capacities? Or, as an article, I think on the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail yesterday, suggested there's real concerns about our native communities up north, for example, with malnutrition and a lot of stress and historical trauma. These people are very vulnerable. And so how? Well, I can't tell anybody personally how they can respond to this. But if you move to do so, I think the best way to support people is through supporting the organizations that work with them. So in the Downtown East Side, there are a number of organizations that do great work. The Downtown East Side Women's Center, for example, and other groups. There are also groups that work with First Nations communities and so on. So I think if you really move to support those vulnerable groups of society, support the organizations that work with them, if you can afford to do so.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, so just, offering practical support in all the ways you can. There's a great question from Rochelle in the chat around how do we differentiate between kind of staying calm, coping well, I'm doing fine, versus kind of a dissociation or a disengagement, which we know then has, negative knock-on effects. How can we help sort of monitor ourselves in that, and maybe some of the folks around us?
I don't know if I can give a general answer to that. I know that when I'm working with individuals, it's pretty quick to, it's pretty easy, I think, to see which kind of coping are we dealing with. Are we dealing with a genuine coping, or are we dealing with dissociation? But the genuine one will be suffused with feeling. The other one will not be. So that in the genuine coping, you'll say, yeah, boy, oh boy, my chest is just full of caged birds trying to escape. Or my belly is a pit of snakes just slithering around, or my throat is tight or dry. And here I am with it. I'm noticing it. The other one, the dissociation, and you will not you will not get that connection to the self. So if you feel yourself disconnected, that's okay too. That's just your system dealing with things the best way it knows how to at the moment. But then notice that you're disconnected. Oh, I'm just not feeling very much right now. Isn't it interesting? So, you can't make any particular coping style wrong. It's whatever gets you through the night, and either way, it's your system trying to cope as best it can with whatever's going on.
Right. So check in with the body is a lot of what I hear you saying as well. And there's a lot of people in the chat sharing strategies around dance and movement.
Absolutely, yeah. That movement, chanting, drumming, singing, musical instruments, not to mention physical exercise,
right?
Yoga, all that stuff.
And you said earlier you have a sense of how you think this might turn out, and there's a lot of people in the chat saying, "We want to know what that is. What does he mean by that?" Do you want to share what you're thinking about that?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. It's only that from my particular understanding of the system, it's not like we believe. This is a political discussion, so I'm not sure that this is the venue for it.
Yeah.
But we do live in a certain socioeconomic system. Nobody's going to dispute that in that socioeconomic system, there's a relatively few people with a lot of wealth and a lot of power who make decisions that most of us don't even get to think about. So if those people stay in charge, things are going to go a certain way.
Right.
If there's a democratic recrudescence, if people actually en masse decide to get involved and no longer cede power to a few others, well, then it'll be a totally different outcome. My guess is that the system will know how to use this crisis to its own advantage. That's what my guess is.
I guess I think seems like a reasonable guess. I think what I'm sensing and from the chat and in my own conversations is just the hope that because we have been unplugging from the normal economic system, we have been learning some more self-resilience. We've been baking bread, and we've been going back to more basic sorts of entertainment and engagement, that there's an opening here.
Yes, there's certainly an opening to recognizing that we don't need all that stuff. I mean, I don't think anybody is busy these days trying to look up on the internet which celebrity is sleeping with which celebrity. All of a sudden, that's become not that important. All of a sudden, we don't have the Stanley Cup fever gearing up, and somehow we're surviving without it. I mean, who cares if the Edmonton Oilers are better than the Boston Bruins, or if you're a soccer fan, whatever, So I think there's kind of a forced withdrawal from a lot of the distractive addictions that the society keeps us happy with or pseudo happy with. So I think many people will learn that, okay, you know what, I really didn't need that stuff in the first place. I thought I did, but I don't really. Now, how many people? That's a different question. And as far as baking bread, well, yeah, we're finding out that we're resilient. We're finding out that we're self-generating. That's great. But that's also a position of luxury and privilege. Some people are suffering terribly because they don't have jobs. They don't know if they'll have jobs to go back to when this is finished. When I walk down Main Street or Cambie Street in Vancouver, and I see all these small businesses shuttered, just how much staying power do they have? They're already operating at a pretty low margin. So I don't know. I don't know that we can generalize
No.
about the benefits of baking bread. I mean, it's great, and for me, it's not a problem because all I was going to do these last 6 months or these next 6 months anyway is to stay home and write a book. Well, guess what? That's what I'm doing. But that's what I would have done anyway.
You got lots of material now.
Well, believe me, I had lots of material before. Um, but what I'm saying is that how we go through this has a lot to do with where we are at culturally and socioeconomically as well. So we can't generalize that way.
It's true. That makes sense. And really, it's such it's oversimplification as well, because, well, I mean, everything will happen. Some people will, lots of systems will, all the systems will react in one way or another. And some things will get better and some things will get worse. And some
Yeah.
people will suffer more, and we can predict, as we normally can, on the whole, who does suffer more. I mean, there's something about the way that this crisis is yet again forcing us to confront the inequities, that makes me hopeful, at least, that we are seeing it in such stark ways that maybe we can't really solve it until we've seen it. And I think that the whole world now has seen how this is impacted, or certainly in North America, looking at the communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted so heavily.
Yeah, but yes, that's true. At the same time, communities of color have been impacted disproportionately for centuries. So maybe this time we'll have learned that lesson. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so that leads to this other question people have asked various versions of, which is, in this kind of time of this liminal space of not being in our normal routines and looking at all this change, does this seem like a good time? People have asked me, is this a good time to be making decisions? Like, if I make a life decision now, am I making it because I can have insight into something I don't normally have? Or am I making it, or I could have been making it from a place of fear and contraction? I mean, again, I don't know if one can generalize, but it's an interesting question.
No, but that's a good question. That's a good question. And the way to find out is to check in with yourself. Am I in a state of fear and contraction? If you are, don't make a decision. Process it. So check in with yourself. I mean, the two different people could be in two different places. One of them, this might be the perfect time to make an important life decision, as long as you experience yourself as present and expansive and calm, and you connect in touch with gut feelings. If there's contraction and tension and fear, no, this is not a great time to make a decision.
Right. So that's a theme that you keep saying: checking with yourself, checking with the body. Really, just take the time to take your own temperature. Another one that is a version of what different people are saying, that if the key attributes of stress are uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control, it puts us into that sort of animal amygdala brain, in fight or flight, where we can't really access our higher functioning selves. Specific tools could you recommend to bring people out of that triggered fight and flight response back into the moment? Just very practical things.
Well, again, the first tool is just to recognize that that's the state you're in. Because one of the things that really what you just alluded to, Karen, is that when we're deep into that state, the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that actually has insight and has some response flexibility, is capable of make choices, is able to calm the amygdala and those agitated emotional circuits. That part of the brain tends to go offline under extreme stress. So the first thing is to notice that that's happened. I mean, once you get to notice it, and then once you notice it, then you just do what you need to, like we talked about. Jump up and down, do some yoga, run around the block, sing some songs, do some chanting, bang a drum, listen to a piece of music, do anything. to get yourself out of that state, or just calmly observe it if you can, and allow it to go through you. Really, these states, once you pay attention to them, they tend to pass, precisely because there's some compassionate presence that creates a sense of safety. So really, I can only repeat what we said earlier about all that stuff.
Yeah, I know. I woke up people ask me how you're doing, how I'm doing, as they are for each other. And, I say, well, some days or some hours even, I'm doing great actually. And other times I'm just feeling overwhelmed and full of grief. And I know I woke up the other morning from I think, a series of bad dreams. And um, I felt, all this tension in my body that I couldn't get out. That I just need, I felt I could feel the tears behind my eyes, and I felt like a sort of a bit of the craziness in my body. And so
Mm-hmm.
my response was to shut my doors and windows and dance and scream. And then I felt much better.
There you go. That's great.
Getting it out of the body.
That's
Um,
great.
and then other times I think, it's people have said it feels weird to feel happy in this, but I think that to feel that there are moments of quiet and reflection for those of us that are privileged enough to have those, and to be able to actually just enjoy those and feel into those.
Well, and what's the teaching? The teaching really is that the happiness has nothing to do with external circumstances,
Right.
because they don't. Those are pretty constant. So if you notice yourself, these strains of happiness arising, well, then there's some internal process going on there, and that's always interesting to pay attention to.
Right. And to let yourself be
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And not to make yourself wrong for it. Like I shouldn't feel this way. How can I feel this way when these terrible things are happening? Well, that's a wrong question.
Right. There's a number of questions coming up about touch, that people who are isolated are really feeling the lack of touch. And
Yeah,
anyway, reflections on that, or
yeah, that's a real problem. That's a real problem for a lot of people. People that live alone, that are not partnered, this is a really hard time, because I have a book somewhere near on my desk here. In fact, here it is. Funny you should say. It's called Touching: The Human Significance of Skin by the great British anthropologist Ashley Montagu. And touching, physical touching, is the most basic way of attaching that human beings have. So little infants, all this debate about sleep training babies. I've just written a chapter about parenting, so this is fresh in my mind. But Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock, talked about the tyranny of the infant and the infant's chronic resistance to sleep. And how you deal with it is you say goodnight and you walk out of the room and you don't come back. This is what parents were taught for generations. They're still being taught that. Well, the baby's chronic resistance to sleep is actually the baby's mechanism to have physical touch with the parent, which is the only way that small infants and children can experience connection, is through physical touch. But now we develop other ways of attaching as we get older. As my friend Gordon Neufeld teaches, there's a number of ways of attaching that don't depend on physical touch, but that's the most basic one, and it stays with us all our lives. And so being massaged and being held and being stroked, well, those are essential human needs. So that's really hard for people. So the first thing is to recognize that's really difficult. But the fortunate thing is that as we get older, we develop other ways of attaching. So we're no longer just limited to the physical way. So employ those. If you have feelings for anybody in your heart, allow yourself to experience them. If you can contact people on the internet, Skype, Zoom, whatever, do so. If there's neighbors that you can say hello to, even 6 feet apart, do it. So substitute other ways of attaching as best you can for the lost one, physical one.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, and there's a lot of questions about leadership coming up in the chat, about what someone said to me yesterday, it's a privilege to lead in this time. And your thoughts on kind of what exceptional leadership looks like now, how we can, what leadership can we offer and look for that will take us through this in the best possible way.
I have to laugh a little bit because I'm being asked these questions with the assumption that I know what I'm talking about, you know.
Yeah, I know.
And then,
A lot of people think you do. There's a lot of questions about leadership, Gabor.
So my first question is, what makes anybody think that I have anything useful to say, you know, on this subject? So having said that, I'll just see what pops up for me. Okay.
Right.
So leadership has to do with discipleship. So Jesus had follower. Disciple is a follower. Now, why did people follow him? It's not because he had some kind of temporal or physical authority. It's because he loved them and he tapped into some deep wisdom that they sensed could teach them and guide them. But it wasn't egotistical. It wasn't about him as a leader. He was just being himself. So I think leadership is for people who don't aspire to be leaders, who just are willing to be themselves, authentic, and who love others and who don't care about any egotistical benefits from being a so-called leader. So if you ask me what are the qualities of leadership, those are the qualities of leadership. Now, it's interesting. You take somebody like Doug Ford in Ontario, who's, in my view, a really troubled and troubling political figure, comes from a highly traumatized family, as we know. And he's the usual populist who wants to destroy social programs and diss teachers and dismiss teachers and all, you know, all the usual stuff. But lo and behold, there's a different aspect of him showing up in this particular crisis. We can actually see more of the human being that's underneath that tight persona that he usually, and that populist Archie Bunker persona that he usually presents. So I think there's something about the present situation that's calling on his higher qualities to show up. So, and he's providing leadership. Now, I might have disagreements with some aspects of it, but I'm talking about the quality of it. And so I think leadership has to do with allowing your higher qualities to be in the lead. That's as much wisdom as I can muster on that question.
Allowing our higher qualities to be in the lead in whatever context we find ourselves in, and really checking in with ourselves about where we are at, checking with our bodies, checking in with where we're at, not judging where we're at, but being present to where we're at. Those are the big things. Those are my big takeaways from this conversation.
Right. I'm just seeing something on the chat here. I'd like to comment on it if I can, okay?
Please.
It just got my attention. Somebody says, I experience happiness from external things. A chalk riddle on the sidewalk on my street by a 7-year-old child and his family this morning, and text from my 8-year-old grandchild in Halifax that experiencing happiness from these external things. Well, yes and no. What they really experience, because I could walk by that same chalk riddle on the sidewalk and not even notice it, or even resent the kid's happiness because I don't have it, you know. So this person who writes very beautifully, her name is Joan, is that she's experiencing happiness in these external things. Well, she's experiencing the happiness in her capacity to enjoy those external things. So still an internal capacity. You know, there's a beautiful poem my wife shared recently by Robert Service about little things. I wish I could find it for you right now, but you look it up. It was Robert Service.
We'll speak it out.
It has to do with the enjoyment and the beauty of little things. Some people really do have the capacity to just to take pleasure from the little things, and for others, it's more difficult. I tell you, I'm one of the latter group. You know, I find it harder to find happiness in those. There's a novel called The God of Little Things. I haven't read it yet, but there is that capacity. But you're not just finding it on the outside, you're finding it within your own capacity to appreciate those things. And for those of us that's more difficult, we can actually look for that capacity.
Right, and for those of us that have been granted some kind of time in this strange pandemic, that while I think it's important for people not to feel like they should be using this time to write the great American novel or learn an instrument, that for them just to look at this capacity about how do we find joy in small things. Maybe that's
actually for me, this is the opportunity to write the great Canadian nonfiction book. That's what my opportunity is.
What are you working on?
Oh, the title is the Myth of Normal: Illness and Health in an Insane Culture.
Uh-huh.
I almost feel I don't have to write the book. I can just publish the book with a lot of empty pages and everybody fill in their own stuff.
I definitely want that book beside me, on my bedside table, so I can look over and feel comforted by that title. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Gabor. We got you for a little longer than we thought we might.